I were to sum up my politics for the last, since I was 18 years old, and I'm now 78 years old, I would say my politics are, anarcho-socialism. That is, that socialism without freedom is slavery. But freedom without socialism is extraction, exploitation, cruelty, barbarity, and all the rest. So I think you have to figure out a way to imagine, we've not seen it, but I think you have to figure out a way to imagine a socialist kind of sensibility along with freedom, or an anarchist sensibility.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with an episode where I am ecstatic to have somebody who I think is a great human being, legendary, revolutionary, author, teacher, cool guy, Mr. Bill Ayers. How are you?
Thank you, Chris. Glad to be here. Glad to see you.
All right. We're gonna jump around. We're gonna talk about a little bit of this and a little bit of that. A brief intro for people that may be living under a rock. You started the Weathermen Underground, which was this great resistance group in the 60s when things started to go down the tubes and fascism was kind of taking over and racist police were killing people like Fred Hampton, and horrible things were happening. You guys escalated things to kind of an even playing field with the violent status quo at the time. Is that a fair assessment?
It's fair. I would say it a little bit differently. I would say that I came of age when the Black Freedom Movement was setting the moral agenda in our country. And I was swept up into that movement because it was a movement for simple justice, a movement for fairness. It was a movement that seemed to be pushing for all the values I was raised with and all the values that the United States, putatively believes in. So getting into the Black Freedom Movement was not a big step for me. I was at the University of Michigan, and then the war in Vietnam exploded. In 1965, the American occupation and invasion took over from the French, and I got caught up into the resistance to that war. And the way I would define the beginning of the Weather Underground is to say that if you started in 1965, when I was first arrested opposing the war in Vietnam, in a nonviolent sit-in at a draft board. And at that point, something like 25% or 20% of people opposed the war. Something like 70% of people were in favor of the war. And over the next 3 years, the activism of the anti-war forces was one huge thing developed. And for me, very important. I did a lot of knocking on doors, a lot of demonstrations, a lot of civil disobedience. But perhaps more important than that, the Black Freedom Movement, which, as I said, was kind of defining the moral landscape at that time. The Black Freedom Movement came out not unanimously, but forcefully against the war. And then GIs started coming home and telling the truth about the war. And that turned the country against the war, so that by 1968, a majority of Americans opposed the war in Vietnam. And certainly an overwhelming supermajority of people in the world opposed the war. So the question was, since we had won the war to explain the war, how do we stop it? And frankly, we couldn't stop it. We'd done all the things we thought in our somewhat naivete was, we thought, you build a majority, you get the government to respond to you. And so the fact that we had a majority and we could not get an anti-war, response from the government meant that it was a crisis both for democracy and for the anti-war movement. And at that point, the movement splintered. I'm the middle of 5 children in my birth family. One of my brothers joined the Democratic Party and tried to build a peace wing within it. One went to the Northeast and joined the communes. One was part of the great migration to Canada to get away from the madness. One went into the factories to organize the working class in Indiana to oppose the war and to support Black liberation. And I did what I did, which was I went with a group of us, went underground, and decided we were going to take the war to the war makers. We'd been arrested many times. We did not want to spend the next decade on trial or in defense committees or working with lawyers. we decided we were going to survive what we thought of as an impending American fascism, and we were going to take the war to the war makers. And so that was the birth of the Weather Underground. It was actually the spring of 1970. I mean, we came out of the 60s direct action movement, but we were born in 1970, and we were underground for 11 years.
When I revisit the 60s, it seems like there was this escalation of hope, and then you hit the year 1970, and disillusionment seemed to reign over everybody.
Well, again, I would put it a little differently. I would say from the time I joined the movement in mid-1960s until 1968, every time we gathered in a church basement or a community center, every time we planned an action, we began by singing. And singing was what bound us together, and singing was what chased away the fear. Singing was what built a kind of culture of resistance. And after 1968, every time we opened our mouths to sing, all we could do was scream. And it was both despair, and it was also a sense that we had been defeated, that we had come so close, and yet we couldn't even stop the war. And as we got more radical, of course, we didn't just want to stop one war. We wanted to stop what we thought of was the engine of all war. And so we became much more intense in terms of trying to create a revolutionary presence in this country. And by 1968, it was pretty grim. I mean, the serial assassination of Black leaders was a defining thing in our lives. The killing of King, the killing of Malcolm X, the killing of civil rights workers, and then the killing of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. These were huge, huge events in our lives. And we felt like this is what's coming. This is what we're living in. And we have to do something to counter it, something to make it step back. And that's kind of the founding of the Weather Underground. We were a revolutionary group. We didn't exactly have a plan, but we knew what we were trying to, we had a strategy to resist going to prison forever, and to resist, as I say, what we thought of as a kind of incipient, particularly American fascism.
Yeah. And so you said before, in 1965 and before, you were at the University of Michigan, is that right?
I went to Michigan in 1963, and I graduated in 1968. Yeah.
Okay. And during this time, were you already aware of the imperialist nature of the United States and history, or is this something that you learned as you went on in the underground?
No, I learned it in those years of opposing the war and fighting for civil rights. I learned it, and one of the things, I have a podcast called Under the Tree, and it's based on the idea that when freedom is the question, you can have a classroom anywhere, under a tree, in a community center, or a church basement. But I learned everything that was important to me to know. I learned in teach-ins, I learned in actions, I learned on the street, I learned in movement gatherings. And so, yeah, I didn't know the nature of imperialism. I grew up, in the 60s and in a kind of deep sense of denial. And so we didn't really know history. And frankly, Americans don't know history today. And living where you live, that people look at America and they say, wow, those folks are so powerful and so ubiquitous on one level, but on another level, they don't know where they are and they don't know who they are. So we tend to think we're the center of the universe. I'll tell you a funny story, because you can look at it from abroad now. But I used to ask my students at the University of Illinois Chicago, undergraduates, I'd say, what percentage of the world's population lives in the United States? And the guesses ranged anywhere from 10% to 45%. I mean, nobody guessed less than 10%. And of course, anyone outside of America knows that that's foolish. And not only do we not know our place in the world, we can't find the rest of the world on a map. And I used to argue during the first and second Iraq wars, I used to argue that we should not be allowed to bomb a place that we can't find on a map. And that if President Bush can't find it on a map, we shouldn't be allowed to bomb it. And so, it's a simple formula. That would be the end of a lot of violence. But yeah, I think that I got radicalized at Michigan. I mentioned teach-ins. The very first teach-in in the world really happened at the University of Michigan in 1965. And the way it happened was there was a military recruiter at the center of campus in a place called the Fishbowl. And some very smart undergraduates put up a sign with a quote from the Nuremberg trials and a big arrow pointing to the military recruiter saying, this man is a war criminal, because the Nuremberg trials are very clear on the fact that you can't get away with saying I was following orders. You have to think about what you're doing. And this was a very provocative sign to put up in the center of the campus when the war in Vietnam was just beginning to escalate. And it led to pandemonium and conversations that roared on for about 10 days. And that was my biggest education right there, that my brother and I, my younger brother and I, stood in the fishbowl for 6-7 hours a day, arguing and learning and debating and listening. And there was a group that put out a fact sheet, 100 facts about Vietnam. The first one I remember very clearly was that Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the United States, said in 1956 that if Vietnam had had free elections, Ho Chi Minh would have gotten 80% of the vote. And that's true. And so suddenly here I am learning about the history of what we're doing. And then I'm learning about Native American history. And I'm learning suddenly, I mean, I knew a lot about Black history, but I learned it in a deeper way. I learned about the ways in which, the afterlife of slavery was still with us. And it was those revelations and that kind of education on the streets that really, really changed the direction of my life. And I couldn't be happier for that education. It wasn't the education I got in the classrooms at the University of Michigan. It was the education I got from my peers and some super smart graduate students and a couple of professors who really wanted to question everything. And what I learned in that was, and then I became a teacher during those years as well. And I learned kind of fundamental lessons about what good learning really is. And I would argue to this day that good learning is asking questions and then asking the next question, being in dialogue, that is speaking with the possibility of being heard, but listening with the possibility of being changed. Even if you think you know what you think, you have to listen and you have to kind of become more complex in how you understand even your principles. And so, and that first teaching happened at the end of that 10 days of intensive education. And the workshop, one of the workshops I went to, a man named Paul Potter, who became a friend and died way too young. Paul was talking about the war, and he drew a verbal picture of what was going on in terms of invading villages and in terms of napalm and in terms of killing civilians and not knowing who the enemy is, so just killing everybody. And how unjust it is to invade a country 10,000 miles away. And he quoted the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee saying, no Black American should go 10,000 miles away to fight for a so-called freedom he doesn't enjoy in Mississippi. And that hit me. And then Paul said from the podium, he said, you need to find a way to live your life so that it doesn't make a mockery of your values. And that phrase stayed with me. And that phrase echoes in my brain to this day, because what he wasn't saying was, here's the 10 commandments or here's the 5 rules you can follow. It wasn't like that. It was like, how do you understand in a complex, dynamic, ever-changing, swirling whirlwind of a world, how do you figure out where to stand and then take a stand? And you know that you're wrong sometimes, but you take a stand, you try to make a difference, and then you rethink. But don't let your life make a mockery of your values. And that continues to kind of motivate me to say, well, what do I value in this situation? And frankly, it's quite helpful because there are all kinds of things in the world you don't know anything about. But if you, for example, respect human beings, then you don't get caught up in saying, I'm going to tell other people I'm not going to hold other people guilty for just living their lives. So I never heard of transgendered until quite recently. But it was an easy move to say, I respect you. Are you kidding?
Are you human? Are you alive? Do you have a nervous system? Yeah, equal rights. Exactly. Boom.
Exactly. It's so simple. But you can't. I'll tell you a cool story about that, by the way, if we can go off.
Please
into this.
Take the reins, my friend.
So I teach at Stateville Prison, and I teach in a college degree granting program. And my latest podcast episode is about the commencement. We just graduated 5 students, and they all were wearing robes, and we convinced the system to let 5 family members in. So we had 25 family members, 10 faculty, guards and staff. Most moving commencement I've ever been at. The commencement speakers were Gina Dent, Angela Davis, and Fred Moten. The entertainment was Chance the Rapper. I kept saying to people, Harvard should have it so good, man. I mean, it was a great graduation. But these guys doing 20, the group of 5 called themselves the 115 Collective. Why? Because between them, they are doing 115 years in prison. Only in America, American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
It's absolutely, it's criminal, and it's cruel, and it's outrageous. And we can get to that another time. But in any case, I had a conversation with the guys. They were going to be meeting some people from the university, and I just wanted to have a conversation about pronouns. And that's a conversation they've never had, right? But in American colleges and stuff, it's a very common conversation. What pronouns you use? So I explained it to them briefly. First guy to speak, guy who's been in prison 22 years. And he said, listen, guys, let's approach this with generosity and with a big imagination. Let's not rush to conclusions, and let's not rush to think we know better. We've been out of it for 22 years. We're getting older. The culture's still moving. So let's try to respect this. And frankly, I'm he, him. And I love that. And then the next guy to speak said, I don't know, man. I'm old school. I don't have pronouns. And the first guy says, hey, man, I is a pronoun. What are you talking about? And the next guy to speak said, we had a white guy transferred up to our block last year, and he was all right, but he kept saying, I've never been around so many colored people. So I had to take him aside and explain, don't call us colored people. That's not how we call ourselves. We call ourselves either Black or Afro-American, African-American, something like that, but don't call us colored. And he understood, and I was just educating him. So thinking about that incident, I'm going to respect this. Whatever you want to be called, whatever pronoun you got, I'm there. Now, see, there's an example where the values, the ethical core is so good that they don't have to get twisted up. And I'm talking about even liberals who mean well.
Right.
They can't stop themselves from kind of beating the shit out of the pronoun question. Why? What's the point? And so I just think it's interesting that I'm returning back to Paul Potter's statement, because it's a good rule of thumb. It doesn't tell you what to do each day, but it does say each day, wake up, check yourself, ask yourself what you really want to stand for, who you want to be in the world. It's not just a matter of your good intentions or your big heart. God bless you. It's not enough to sit on the couch smoking a joint having good intentions. You have to do something, and you have to live your life, and you have to live it in a way that's consistent with your values.
Yeah. This is really important right now that left, right, no matter, don't make equivocations about, the people that you're willing to give rights to. I'm even vegan, where I think animals are awesome. Let's give them some benefit of the doubt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the things, I often ask my students, are you against slavery? And they all say, yeah, of course. And I say, well, I mean, we could parse that in a lot of different ways, but I always say, if you were against slavery in 1850, you would have been against the founders, the Constitution, the law, your parents, the Bible, your preacher, and your neighbors. But so, God bless you, you're against slavery now, and you're for a woman's right to vote, right? Oh, yeah. But if 100 years ago you'd been for a woman's right to vote, you'd been against the Constitution, the founders, the laws, your preacher, the Bible. But okay, let's grant ourselves we're all good people now. So then the question is, what's happening now? That 20 years from now, if things work out in a certain way, your grandchildren's generation are going to say to you, what? That you believed in that shit? You know that there were 2.2 million of your fellow citizens in prison? And some of them were 4 miles from where your university is. Oh, I didn't know that. Yes, I looked it up. And what did you do about it? I didn't know. Yes, you did know. And the reason I know people know about prisons, when I taught at the University of Illinois, I've been retired for 12 years from the University of Illinois. I still teach at the University of Chicago. And Stateville Prison. But sometimes I used to say to my students at UIC, do you know that that exactly 1.5 miles from our campus where we're meeting, there are 6,000 Jewish women in cages? What? That you're lying. Okay, let me modify it. 1.5 miles from here, there are 6,000 black men living in cages. Do you know that? Oh, what'd they do? Ah, so you do know. You know, you pretended you didn't know, but you know. And you assume that they did something, right? And maybe they did do something, but when did you get the right to erase their humanity? When did you get the right to say they're no longer human, worthy of art, education, knowledge, all the things that you feel like you have the right to? When did you feel that they didn't have the right to agency or a history or a point of view? So those are the kind of things that I struggle with all the time and continue to struggle with.
Yeah, sure. And I think there's a certain amount of conditioning because we have private prisons and we have a whole system set up to make sure that, like Ronald Reagan made sure this great, wonderful human being, made sure that this became a cultural thing. Let's lock them up. And to my imagination, if private prison can send out contracts for prison labor, then nothing has changed in 175 years.
You know, I'll bet you didn't see this because most Americans didn't see it. And living abroad, I bet you didn't see this. At the midterms, all the commentary about the midterms, do you know that 5 states voted on the question of slavery?
Okay.
5 states had on their ballots propositions that said we're going to remove from our state constitution the language of the 13th Amendment. And the language of the 13th Amendment is language that says no one should be held in slavery and voluntary servitude unless they've been convicted of crime. Now that's the 13th Amendment. Read the whole amendment and you want to tear your hair out. But okay, 5 states under the leadership of a movement that's here in the United States around getting rid of this language, 5 states voted on it. 4 voted to eliminate that language. Louisiana voted to keep the language.
Go figure.
And I said to a friend from Oklahoma, well, at least Oklahoma voted to get rid of the language. He said 35% voted to keep it. He said, so when I'm in the grocery store, I'm looking around, I'm thinking, holy shit, three of these people think I should be a slave, and so, I mean, we are really, for all of our public relations and our self-conception, we are a very backward and reactionary society. And the contradiction of our ideals and our reality could drive a person crazy, but it's more and more and more in focus in the last couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't feel, do you feel like we have made any progress, or do you think this is cyclical, what we're going through, as far as we're seeing ignorance just perpetuate itself?
I don't think it's cyclical. I don't think history is cyclical, but I think, I think progress is a tricky question. I think that everything that you and I might care about is contested. And if you look at the deep history of the United States and look at the United States today, this is a country that was founded on white supremacist values. It was founded on land theft and genocide. It was founded on kidnapping and human trafficking and forced labor. That's the history. It's deep in our DNA. It's a violent DNA. It's a torturous DNA. This is what we live with. And white supremacy, there's always a base for it in our country. It's baked into law and culture, but there's always a base for it. I've never seen it as well organized and led as it is today. On the other hand, after the murder of George Floyd, yo, dude, yo, Bernadine, you're being taped.
I'm keeping it in.
Apparently, Messi just scored a goal.
All right, we're happy for Bernadine.
Yeah, exactly. But I've lost my thread.
Yeah. Well, the correlation between that now and then, if we're making
Oh,
progress.
well, I was saying about white supremacy, I was saying not only is it never been as well organized and directed, but it's also true that after the murder of George Floyd, I've never been involved in a larger mass demonstration against racism as I was then. So we not only had demonstrations in Chicago and New York and Detroit, but after some of those demonstrations, we were driving across the country. We joined a demonstration in Lincoln, Nebraska. Everywhere in the country, 26 million people. Now, is it solidified? Is it organized? Not really. But is it an impulse that you can build on? Absolutely. So I would say, if I were to name this political moment, I would say it's a moment of great, great danger. That the danger of fascism, all the pillars of fascism are in place. And of course, everyone knows that it'll be, if we do have fascism in this country, it'll be a peculiar American fascism wrapped in the American flag, toting the Bible. But nonetheless, fascism is a real danger. And I think we have to unite against that danger. Those of us who are revolutionaries and radicals and freedom fighters, but also liberals and independents have to look at the danger in the eye. On the other hand, I think we are poised for great potential for fundamental transformation. And the reason I think that is because the contradictions are just too stark. I mean, we're looking at, I'm thinking for a minute about freedom, and I'm thinking about the fact that everyone knows that the Civil War was fought over freedom. But one of the things people forget is that the American Civil War, if you look at the literature from both sides, they were both fighting for freedom. One was for the freedom of the enslaved workers, and the other side was fighting for the freedom to own human beings. Now we're in a similar kind of thing today, where the people who are the extractors and the fossil fuel exploiters and the people who want to squeeze the last nickel and steal the furniture and all the rest of it, those people are fighting for freedom. And if you said to them, you do not have the right to build a pipeline through this river, you don't have that right. And they say, but wait, I'm free. It's America. I should be free. And you look at our revolting Supreme Court. I mean, talk about an anti-democratic set of institutions, not only the Electoral College, the Supreme Court, the Senate. I mean, these are just reactionary. They were installed for the purpose of blocking popular power. But you look at our Supreme Court today, every decision they've made since they became a supermajority of hard right-wing Opus Dei lunatics, every decision they've made in the name of freedom. So the freedom to steal the elections, the freedom to push women for the state to force women to have children. I mean, that's one that's just driving me up a tree right now, because I was reminding a group of high school students I was speaking to a month ago. They were asking about the Dobbs decision in Roe versus Wade. And I'm of an age where the people who were my contemporaries, and many of them my friends, were the people who ran the Jane Collective here in Chicago, in Hyde Park. The Janes were an illegal network of abortion providers. I don't know if you've seen the movies, but there's a couple of great documentaries out, one called The Janes. And Heather Booth, who I interviewed on my podcast, was one of the founders of this group. And what it was a group at the University of Chicago. If you got pregnant and you couldn't deal with it, there was on phone booths and all over the campus that called Jane. And there was a couple of phone numbers, and they had an underground network to get you to a safe abortion. So, but I was reminding kids in Columbus, Ohio, who were debating this question, that there was a time in American history when the state forced women to have babies. It was compulsory that you have babies. When was that? That was slavery. That was in Virginia. The industrial production of workers was on the agenda. That's what we were, doing as a state. And so that's worth remembering, that history.
Yeah. And yeah, I see correlations between then and now, especially when we have billionaire tyrants talking about underpopulation and things like this. And then you have the Supreme Court turning around and doing what they're doing, which is making sure. But yeah, you're right. Freedom is this word, like the great George Carlin said, rights are just made up. We made them up, and they're only as good as common sense. And
as the people demand it. One of the things I think we lose track of is any progress we've ever made. First of all, backing up and talking a minute about rights, I mean, it's only in the last couple hundred years that the thousands years history of states has a state done anything to forward human freedom. I mean, the states are not the vehicle for human freedom, right? I mean, that's only recent that and when they have granted human freedom, it's only been in reaction to tremendous pressure from below. So my politics tell me again and again that our job is to organize fire from below, because that's the only way in which you're going to ever see forward progress. And the state will only move if you move it. So in our history, Lyndon Johnson, who passed the most far-reaching civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, was a cracker from Texas. He didn't think that up on his own. That came from fire from below. He was asking King for meetings, not the other way around. Franklin Roosevelt, a patrician from the Hudson Valley, passed the most far-reaching labor legislation. Why? Because of fire from below. And the most killing example is Abraham Lincoln. Nobody in America reads his first inaugural address because it's when he genuflects before the slave owners and says, I have no interest in interrupting slavery. His second inaugural address is the one we memorize as school kids. That could have been written, and maybe was written, by Frederick Douglass. That's the speech in which he says, for every drop of blood drawn by the lash, we will draw a drop of blood by the sword. And he makes a case for reparations. I mean, holy shit, Abe. I mean, but he wasn't always that way. And he was responding to fire from below as well. And so our job is to create that fire from below. Our job is to see the contradictions, the contradictions in the space itself. So the contradiction of white supremacy or human freedom. We need to see that. And you're right to say that freedom is one of those terms that anyone can deploy it for any reason. Even the word revolution, we in the United States, we have revolutionary deodorant. I mean, and revolutionary potato chips. I mean, it's crazy. But that means that puts a bigger burden on us simply to be very clear about what we're talking about. So when we're talking about freedom, for me, we have to be naming unfreedom. The unfreedom in front of us is what makes freedom come into view. And often it's the case that the times we feel most free isn't that we've arrived at a destination, we're sitting on our couch smoking a joint, I'm free. That's not when you feel free. When you feel free is when you've named something standing in your way and you've linked arms with others to change it. And there are so many examples, and I'll give you one in American history. Frederick Douglass, one of his great scenes in his autobiography is when he writes about a time when his master's son came to beat him. And he stood up and he fought the man, and he fought him to a standstill. He could have bloodied him and hurt him, but he decided not to. And he fought the man to a standstill, and miraculously he wasn't punished. But when he wrote about it later, he said, for those few minutes, I was free. I felt free. He wasn't free. He wasn't free in any sense except in the sense of standing up against oppression, naming it, being open about it, standing up against it. That's what makes you free.
That sounds like me, because I'm not a big guy, but I'll never back down. So I just get my ass kicked all the time.
Excellent. If it's for the right reason.
Well, mostly. Just, I mean, and I'm a strong believer in, equality and empathy and, Jesus Christ. I look around and I see just swaths and big groups of people that are incapable of feeling something for other people. I guess that's what we're talking about. Yeah,
we are. I mean, I think it's part of the human condition, but I also think it's part of American culture in a very extreme sense. So we suffer in this country from a kind of culture of toxic individualism. the heroes in the culture of the John Wayne, the Western cowboy, and we kind of promote these things to the point where our language lacks any nod even towards social or collective. You were mentioning Ronald Reagan before, and Ronald Reagan, of course, famously said, the government, is not the solution. The government is the problem. And his evil twin, Margaret Thatcher, said, there is no such thing as society. There is no such thing. So you take those two pillars, and that's the culture of American reactionary politics today. There's no such thing as society, and government isn't the solution to your problem. It is the problem. So that means, for example, that when we talk about public safety, the answer is get a gun, protect yourself. When we talk about public schools, we're saying buy the best education you can get. We're not saying that it's a human right. When we talk about public health, we're saying stay healthy. We don't have a public health system anymore in the United States. And it means when we face something like this pandemic, it's very hard to turn on a dime and say, all these decades, it's every boat on its own bottom. Now suddenly we're a collective. We're not a collective. We don't see ourselves that way. And in international surveys, the United States always comes out on top when it comes to the question of individualism. So everything gets reduced to the individual level. Everything is, and even the word public is another contested term. Public is a racialized term in the United States. When people talk about public welfare, they're not talking about general dynamics sucking on the government's breasts. They're talking about poor Black people in the inner city. Yeah. When they say public hospital, you imagine a rundown hospital in the city. Public housing, it's a wreck. Why? Why is public racialized? And why is the public the enemy somehow of progress and liberty?
I will say something about public restrooms. They are quite disgusting.
But they shouldn't be.
They shouldn't be. They could be.
We should.
If we changed our values, maybe we could live in this where people wouldn't be. They wouldn't be carving swastikas into the toilet seat in a public.
No. That's exactly my point. In fact, when my son was district attorney of San Francisco, and he often said, the problems that you all keep talking about are not criminal justice problems. They're social problems. So you don't like people urinating in the street on Market Street and on Mission Street, fine. Put in beautiful toilets with somebody who's an attendant. Have a flower pot in each sink. Yeah. And give people an opportunity to live with dignity. Yeah. And it's so easy for me to imagine how we could do that on so many levels. The fact that we have become accustomed to seeing unhoused children on the streets of Chicago and Los Angeles and New York is appalling. And that's another example where you ask middle class anesthetized people, and I'll get to that in 1 second. I'm giving you another thought. But when you ask people, well, look at all the homelessness, and you say, well, why don't they find a house? Because they can't. And then you listen to ads on the TV or the radio about medicine. The United States actually advertises medicine. They don't do that where you are, but they advertise medicine. It's always these chirpy young people looking great, and they can cure their skin problems with this pill. And then they have to obligatorily say what the downside is, and it's anal bleeding and suicidal thoughts. But what the hell? You'll have clear complexion. It's insane. It's
as long as I lick the people in the commercials, I'll take whatever.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the point. Everything's for sale. And I said this about ask middle class people. The thing that people, I think, often miss about the problem of privilege is that the real problem of privilege isn't that some people have stuff and other people don't. It's that privilege anesthetizes you. Privilege puts you to sleep. So it's hard for white people to see, and it takes effort for white people to see what the experience of a cop in your neighborhood is for a Black kid on the South Side. It's hard for men to see what women go through. It's hard for straight people to understand gay people. And that means that you have to make a conscious effort to listen systematically to the people who are suffering the problems and naming the problems in order to be in solidarity with them, rather than think you're somehow the default position. The arrogance of it is staggering. And when it gets transferred into politics, it leads to authoritarianism and autocracy and a lot else.
Yeah, because our primitive instinct is to be give our brain a break from having to empathize with other people. Let's just try to, and then I see that in the most redneck kind of backwoods kind of people. They just really want to save energy with their brain and stuff. And my neck hurts from agreeing with you so much. I'm sitting here nodding. But I think it goes back to that Margaret Thatcher thing and the Milton Friedman idea of economics that they invented, which is based on complete bullshit, which says every person is equal and has the equal amount of opportunity, which is absolutely untrue. Would you?
It is untrue. It's absolutely untrue. But there's another aspect to it, which is the assumption that everyone could be a millionaire is nuts. And so the idea that somehow, instead of seeing the world that we're facing as a world that we're facing collectively, that we actually need one another, that we actually, but to the extent that we fall into the default position of narcissism, and that it has a social base and a social and a cultural push, so that narcissism is not only normalized, but it becomes toxic. When I say it's normal in a certain way, I'll give you an example. If I talking to my students and we go to the same seminar, it's my seminar, but I call it my seminar. And I say, my seminar is a pretty good seminar. And I'm, I go home and say to my partner, it was a great class. And my student goes home and says to her partner, God, it was so boring, I almost fell asleep. Who's right? I mean, the point is we could both be right from our narrow perspective. But that tells you something about what our problem is as a species. Here's this vast world, this gigantic universe, and we select one tiny thread of it, me, and we start to build an entire world view around me. And on the one hand, that's very normal. I mean, I say my grandchildren, my son. I don't think my granddaughter would ever introduce herself to somebody saying, hi, I'm Bill's granddaughter. No, that's not her. That's not who she is. That's who she is to me. And I think we do that all the time. If I'm telling the story of my birth family, I say my father was a workaholic. My mother was a Pollyanna. My sister was not in touch with her feelings. My other brother was an alcoholic. As soon as I start talking like that, you can see that it's completely insane, right? Because nobody else in that diagram would describe it the way I just described it. My sister wouldn't say, hi, I'm Bill's sister. My name doesn't matter, but I'm out of touch with my feelings anyway. She wouldn't say that. So it's stupid for me to put too much stock in it. Now, we work that way, but as long as we have enough humility to say, it's false. I know, I think it, but it's false. Then we have the possibility, and one of the ways you can get in tune with that is through literature, through art, through systematically going to other people and listening and trying to learn from other people.
Personal suffering, too.
Well, there is that. But even without asking people to suffer, you can read a novel and recognize that there are other people who have a different perspective than you do. And you can build human empathy that way. But, if you take that narcissism to an extreme, and if you make it a political position, there lies autocracy and fascism. The idea that my worldview is the only worldview. So when you have people like the former president of the United States saying, only I can solve it, that is a very fascistic kind of mentality.
When I hear people say stuff like that, my ears go up. I say, watch this guy. He's no good.
Yeah.
And I watched the debate with you and Dinesh D'Souza, the douchebag McGee. You had a Q&A after, and somebody really came up and said, I paid for my car with my money, and I don't want to have to pay taxes, and it's me. And you said, well, did you take a road here? And it's just like her brain exploded,
Yeah, I like to think that she was on a socialist road. I mean, that's what's so crazy is that you can convince yourself, especially in a toxic culture like ours, you can convince yourself that you did everything by yourself or it was your family. But the interesting thing is, not one of us would live for 2 days without the labor of hundreds and thousands and millions of others. There's not only the roads and the water system, there's the electricity coming right through here. Who put that there? Who put the wires in? Who mined the copper? I mean, and building a sense that we are living in splendid isolation, it creates this backward thinking. But the other part of it is it creates an ethics of mutual disregard, mutual indifference. And, I often say to students, that the opposite of moral is not immoral, it's indifferent. If you don't notice, then you're not being a moral person. If you don't see or don't try to see. And so the contract of mutual indifference is basically an understanding that I'm not going to help you. You're on your own. But then I have to understand you're not going to help me either. And so we're all floating out here desperate, lonely, frightened, scared, because we know deep down that I couldn't live a day without you, and you couldn't live a day without me. But we push that to the background, and we act as if I'm living here in splendid isolation, which means I'm lonely and I'm terrified.
Yeah. And it's predicated, once again, on the false assumption that everybody has equal opportunity.
Well, there's the equal opportunity part of it. But as I say, I agree with that completely. But I would add to that if we say everybody has an equal opportunity, we got to be careful.
Well, that's not true.
No, it's not true. But what would it mean if everybody could be the chairman of General Motors? That's a dystopian vision as well, So I don't want that. I want to live. I guess the way I would put it, I guess my politics. If I were to sum up my politics for since I was 18 years old, and I'm now 78 years old, I would say my politics are, anarcho-socialism. That is, that socialism without freedom is slavery. But freedom without socialism is extraction, exploitation, cruelty, barbarity, and all the rest. So I think you have to figure out a way to imagine, we've not seen it, but I think you have to figure out a way to imagine a socialist kind of sensibility along with freedom, or an anarchist sensibility. And I always point to, I know the word family the word dysfunctional family is redundant. All families are dysfunctional. On the other hand, when I think about a good daycare center, a good kindergarten, or a good family, there are certain aspects of it that should be true of society. That is, we account for differences in a family. We share resources. It's from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. I didn't make my 2-year-old son dance on tabletops for change in order to eat. I let him eat anyway, even though I wasn't earning his keep. So what you were saying about I don't want to pay taxes for other people. If the normal response to having a family is to say, we will account for differences of ability and differences of access and differences of, interest and so on. We can account for that in a family of 7 or 8. Why can't we account for it in a village of 80,000 or a city of 8 million? We can, but we won't. And why won't we? Because of capitalism. And that takes us down a different road.
That's next episode. Everybody tune in. Next time, Bill Ayers will make me angry and sad once again. No. But I also want to say, it seems like wealth and the people that have these people that are shouting in front of you at the Q&A, they also suffer from this thing where the money makes them invulnerable to criticism too, which also is just like this huge handicap from moving you further and further away from a community-oriented attitude, which we've evolved to have.
No, it's true. And I think you can see, one of the things I'm hopeful about in terms of the current Elon Musk fiasco is that people will break in their consciousness from any idea that wealth and that kind of material success is linked in any way to intelligence, or certainly in any way to a moral compass. There is no link. My brother always said for years he would say about Bill Gates, the fact that Bill Gates can appoint himself Commissioner of American Education and Commissioner of World Health speaks volumes about the weaknesses of our tax system. Because how does who appointed him? Well, he was so smart. No, he wasn't. You look at, for example, the drugs, Pfizer and all these people getting rich. That was government research that did that. That was socialist research for capitalist profit. And the same is true of Gates and the internet and all the rest of it. That is not the production of one brilliant person. It's just wrong. And so I think we have to fight hard to get people to not only hold hands and love one another, but also to recognize that we are in this together and that there is no such thing as an individual succeeding without an entire cast of thousands. And that brings me, you mentioned veganism, but it also brings me to another kind of, we had talked about slavery and people willing to burn down the whole house for the freedom to own other human beings. We're now living with a cast of characters that's willing to destroy the possibility of human life on Earth in order to get the last nickel out of it. And the mythology is just staggering. So the ocean is infinite, according to the mythology. If you've ever been to the ocean, there's nothing could be further from the truth. It's big, but it's not infinite. And it can't take an infinite assault and still survive. And if it doesn't survive, humans can't survive. And so, these are the
great Paul Watson.
Yeah, exactly. And these are the kind of things that we have to, I think, keep talking about and making sense of. So you asked earlier about progress. I'm not a believer in kind of, the arc of history and so on. On the other hand, I do think that it's kind of astonishing, and now we have to kind of organize and make it real. It's astonishing that things like reparations are talked about in the New York Times and on CBS. It's astonishing that the kind of radical environmentalism, social justice environmentalism, makes its way into the establishment conversation. I think those are good things to build on. I think we should not kind of poo-poo their hypocrisy so much as we should seize it and build on it and say, yes, the world is finite. Human species is not inevitably going to live forever. And we ought to, the planet will go on for millions of years, but it could be without humans. And that's a damn shame because we would have wrecked it.
Yeah. There's a funny quote I heard the other day. It said, there's a bunch of monkeys and one monkey out of all the monkeys takes all the bananas and goes and hoards them for himself. So if this happened, scientists would be studying this monkey to see what's wrong with him. And in the case of humans, we put him on the cover of Forbes magazine.
Good point. Very good point. These monsters, it's true throughout history. These monsters, you're speaking about fascism. We're looking the other day at pictures of Charles Lindbergh at Madison Square Garden speaking in front of American flags and swastikas. And that was normal until Hitler and fascism, Hitlerism and fascism were defeated in a great war. But in the 1930s, that was a large political movement. That wasn't something that was small. And Charles Lindbergh, of course, was the most famous, but there were many other. Henry Ford was the other one. Nice.
I had the great journalist Jonathan M. Katz on my show, and he talked about Smedley Butler, this great, he was an imperialist Navy guy, came back, and then a capitalist like J.P. Morgan said, hey, you want to do a coup for capitalism? And he was like, no, I don't. And I'm going to tell everybody you said that.
Right. Well, Smedley was great. He's the one who talked about, the war fever and how it destroys a culture and a people. Yeah. And he was right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave it there. Look, wonderful to talk with you. Honestly, I hope that we do this again.
Let's do it.
You have a few books out. Which ones can we lead people towards? There's Fugitive Days. You've written over 20 books. What's going on?
Well, the two books, the two memoirs are Fugitive Days and Public Enemy, and they're both published by Beacon. But I have a book that I call a radical manifesto, published by Haymarket Books, called Demand the Impossible, a radical manifesto. And then most of my books are actually about young people and about teaching. So my latest book is actually called About Becoming a Teacher. And it's a tiny little book to try to convince you and everybody else that a life in teaching is worth living. And it explains how you can take steps toward becoming a teacher and what it means to be a teacher for the future and for humanity, not a teacher passing on the mistakes of the past.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm going to find them all. I'm going to put the links in the description. You also have a podcast, Under the Tree.
Under the Tree, a seminar on freedom. And we've got 64 episodes in the can, and we're going strong. But the episode I dropped last week is the one I'm happiest with right now, which is, it's about the commencement that we had for these 5 brilliant students from Stateville Prison. None of them with a way out of prison at this point, but all of them, I'm certain, are going to find a way out. And we're all working double time to make that happen.
Awesome. Awesome. Everybody stay awake and stay alert, because you could be next as far as that goes. My guest, Bill Ayers, the wonderful human being. Good adjective to describe you. Just a wonderful human being. We'll see you next time. I'm going to wave goodbye to everybody in TV land. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.